I want you to imagine a scenario for a second. Um, it's the mid-1960s, you're a business executive, and you are running late for a flight from New York to Washington, D.C.
Which is a stressful situation even today.
Oh, completely. So you sprint through the terminal, your heart's pounding, and you get to the gate just in time to see the boarding doors close on this massive 95-seat Lockheed Constellation aircraft.
And it is completely full, not a single seat left.
Right. You missed it. Now, in our modern era of flying, you'd be looking at an overnight stay, massive rebooking fees, just a huge headache.
Oh, yeah. A logistical nightmare.
But in this scenario, in the 1960s, the gate agent just smiles at you. They pick up a radio, and they literally roll out a second, entirely empty 95-seat aircraft. They fire up the engines, and they fly to Washington, D.C. just for you.
I mean, it sounds like pure fiction today, but that was a daily guaranteed reality back then. It was really the ultimate flex of corporate and logistical muscle.
Exactly. And that flex belonged to Eastern Airlines. Welcome to this investigative deep dive for Peak to Dust, where we explore the rise and fall of giants in history. Today, we are chronicling a journey from peak to dust.
And we are doing a rigorous postmortem of a true corporate titan.
Right, because Eastern Airlines wasn't just a company. I mean, it was an empire.
Okay.
From 1926 until its highly publicized, really agonizing liquidation in 1991, it essentially defined what air travel meant in the United States.
It really did. When you look at the original Big Four domestic carriers that built the American aviation industry, Eastern is just this massive cornerstone.
Yeah.
But the reason we're dissecting their history today, the mission of this deep dive, is because their collapse is one of the most complex, multi-layered failures in business history.
It wasn't just one bad decision, was it?
No, not at all. It was a cascading failure. You have corporate strategy missteps, a vicious war over labor relations, and this completely unpredictable shift in government regulations.
So for you listening, this isn't just a story about airplanes. It is a cautionary tale. We're going to explore how an airline that pioneered commercial aviation, established the legendary Great Silver Fleet, and held this absolute monopoly over East Coast travel could just plummet into one of the most catastrophic bankruptcies in American history.
And to understand how hard they fell, we really have to look at how they built the mountain they were standing on in the first place.
Right. Let's get into that, because that mountain was built on mail, not passengers.
Exactly. If we go back to the nascent days of aviation in 1927. And he didn't care about passenger comfort at all. He cared about securing government contracts. So he got the contract to fly the U.S. mail between New York City and Atlanta.
Using those tiny single-engine mail-wing aircraft.
Right, precisely.
Which is such a wild image compared to the jumbo jets we think of today. But that little mail route was the seed of the empire.
It was. And then in 1929, the consolidation of aviation power really begins. A businessman named Clement Keyes, who owned North American Aviation, he bought Pitcairn's company.
And he rebranded it, right?
Yeah, he rebranded it as Eastern Air Transport in 1930. And he started putting passengers on those mail routes.
Right, expanding service across, I think it was 16 cities on the eastern seaboard, stretching all the way down into Augusta and Savannah.
He did. But the true catalyst that turned them from just a regional player into an untouchable monopoly was, well, it was entirely political.
Okay, this is where it gets interesting.
Right. To understand Eastern's dominance, you have to understand the Airmail Act of 1934 and the infamous Spoils Conference that preceded it.
Okay, let's slow down and explain the mechanics of this, because, the Spoils Conference sounds like something out of a mafia movie. How did a few guys in a room essentially carve up the sky?
Well, I mean, that's practically what it was. In 1930, under President Hoover, the Postmaster General was a man named Walter Folger Brown. And Brown believed that the aviation industry was just too chaotic. There were too many small, underfunded airlines flying the mail. He wanted a few massive, financially stable corporations to run the entire network.
So he just forced it to happen.
Basically. He held a series of secret meetings in Washington with the executives of the top airlines. They literally looked at a map of the United States and divided the nation's airmail routes among themselves.
Wow.
Yeah, They deliberately shut out all the smaller competitors.
I mean, that is just blatant collusion. They were essentially creating a government-sanctioned cartel.
It absolutely was a cartel. And when the press and the smaller airlines finally found out, it generated a massive political scandal.
Only imagine.
Oh, it was huge. When Franklin D. Roosevelt's administration took over, they were furious. They canceled all the private airmail contracts immediately and handed the duties over to the U.S. military.
But the military wasn't equipped for that, right?
Yeah.
I imagine flying a predetermined commercial mail route requires very different logistics than, say, military training.
It was a total disaster. The military pilots didn't have the right instruments for bad weather flying. They didn't know the routes. And tragically, several pilots actually died in crashes within just the first few weeks.
Well, that's terrible.
It was. The Roosevelt administration quickly realized they had made a terrible mistake. The military just couldn't do it. The private airlines were the only ones with the proper infrastructure.
So they had to go back to the very guys they just fired.
Exactly. So in 1934, they restored the private contract system, but they put a strict rule in place. Any airline involved in the illegal spoils conference was barred from bidding on the new contracts.
So if you were one of the big guys who colluded, you were legally locked out.
Right.
But this is where the corporate loophole comes in. How did they actually get around it?
You won't believe it. They just changed their names.
Are you serious?
It was incredibly brazen. Eastern Air Transport simply rebranded itself as Eastern Airlines. New name, new stationery, same exact company. And they won back all their massive routes.
That is unbelievable. Just completely untouchable. And through that legislative maneuvering, Eastern really cemented its status as one of the big four domestic carriers, alongside United, TWA, and American.
They absolutely did.
But what stands out to me here, when you look at the data, is how differently Eastern played the game. United, TWA, and American were in this brutal, bloody fight for transcontinental dominance, flying from New York to LA or Chicago to San Francisco.
Rich cross-country routes, yeah.
Right. But Eastern didn't even try to fight that war. They looked at the map and they just cornered the East Coast.
Exactly. It was a brilliant geographic strategy. They locked down the contracts from New York all the way down to Miami.
Because of the weather?
Yeah. They realized that while business travel was important, there was this incredible, entirely untapped market for leisure travel.
I see.
They became the primary funnel, taking people from the freezing cold winters of the Northeast down to the warm vacation resorts of Florida.
It reminds me so much of the railroad barons of the 19th century.
Oh, definitely.
If you look at how those empires were built, success wasn't really about having the absolute best technology or the most comfortable trains. It was about securing the land rights, locking down government contracts, and leveraging legislative monopolies to completely freeze out the competition.
Right, you build a moat around your business.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Eastern built a fortress on the East Coast, and that fortress was handed over to a man who had become an absolute legend in aviation, Eddie Rickenbacker.
Captain Eddie Rickenbacker. I mean, his acquisition of Eastern Airlines in 1938 is what truly kicks off the airline's golden age.
And he was already famous before this, wasn't he?
Oh, he was an American hero. He was a World War I flying ace from the 94th Aero Squadron, a former race car driver. He was actually serving as the general manager of Eastern when he found out that General Motors, which owned the airline through a holding company, was planning to sell it off.
And he didn't just sit back and let it happen. He went directly to Alfred P. Sloan, the CEO of General Motors, and basically bought the airline himself.
He did. He scrambled, he raised the funds from various backers, and he handed Sloan a certified check for $3.5 million. Rickenbacker was now the master of Eastern Airlines.
Which, adjusted for inflation today, is a staggering amount of money.
Massive.
But Rickenbacker wasn't just a figurehead on the letterhead. He had a management style that was, militant is probably the most polite word for it. We are talking about an autocratic, penny-pinching CEO who was obsessed with the bottom line.
Obsessed is exactly the right word. He instituted a culture of extreme frugality that became the stuff of corporate legend. I mean, Rickenbacker personally reviewed and approved every single company expenditure that was over $50.
Every single one. That's micromanagement on another level.
Over $50, yes. He also demanded his executives work on Saturdays. He authored a manifesto for the company titled My Constitution, which outlined 12 rigid principles of business.
Wow. But here's the thing. You have to look at the numbers here. You can't argue with the math.
Yeah.
That absolute ruthlessness yielded unprecedented financial results.
It really did.
Under Rickenbacker, Eastern transformed into the very first national airline to turn a profit on passenger operations alone.
Ooh.
They didn't need government airmail subsidies to survive anymore.
His financial prudence was undeniable. Under his command, Eastern maintained profitability every single year from 1934 all the way through 1959.
That's a 25-year streak.
Yeah. And during World War II, the airline proved its strategic value to the whole country. They formed the Military Transport Division, utilizing Curtiss C-46 commandos to fly military support routes.
Connecting Florida, Pennsylvania, Texas, and even down into the Caribbean. Right.
Exactly. And this gave their pilots incredible operational experience and positioned them perfectly for the post-war boom.
Right, the post-war boom. This is where the brand identity really crystallizes for Eastern. Rickenbacker capitalizes on this momentum to build what he famously dubbed the Great Silver Fleet.
And this fleet was an aviation marvel at the time. We're looking at planes that literally defined mid-century travel.
Like the DC-3s.
Yeah, the Douglas DC-2s, the DC-3s, the DC-4s, and eventually those iconic Lockheed Constellations with their distinct triple-tail design.
They look so cool.
They did. And to give you a sense of scale, by 1939, Eastern was already flying 103 million passenger miles annually.
Wait, 1939, before commercial flight was even truly mainstream, they were pushing over 100 million miles. That's staggering.
It is. And by 1956, their peak profitability reached $14.7 million for the year. And perhaps most importantly, they achieved an unparalleled safety record for that era.
That was a record?
25 years without a single passenger fatality prior to a tragic crash in 1937. Rickenbacker's obsession with operational efficiency really worked.
Right.
He had a phrase he loved to use, putting bums on seats. To him, an empty seat was a perishable commodity. If the plane is on the ground, it's losing money. Keep it in the air, keep it full.
But I want to pause here for a second.
Right.
Because when you look at the DNA of a company, the things that make them successful early on are often the exact things that kill them later.
That's very true.
So let me play devil's advocate with Rickenbacker's legacy here. Did his absolute authority and that notorious frugality actually create a rigid, brittle culture that inherently doomed them? Because from what the sources show, he was cheap to the point of actively insulting his customers.
He absolutely was. It was a major blind spot.
I mean, he notoriously refused to spend more than $1.25 on an in-flight meal.
Right.
And while other airlines were introducing covered jetways so passengers could walk onto the plane comfortably, Rickenbacker refused to pay for them. He literally left Eastern passengers to walk out on the tarmac in the rain and snow.
He didn't see the return on investment for comfort.
Yeah, and he bred such a deep culture of customer resentment that a group of businessmen who had to commute on his planes actually formed a club called the Wheel Club, WHEAL. We hate Eastern Airlines.
It's incredible to think about.
When your own frequent flyers are making acronyms about how much they disguise you, isn't that a massive red flag?
It was a massive red flag, and it highlights the central paradox of Rickenbacker's legacy. He built a financial fortress, but he completely starved the brand.
Right.
His refusal to invest in customer comfort was bad, but his reluctance to embrace new technology was fatal. As the late 1950s approached, the jet age arrived. Competitors like Delta Airlines, which was Eastern's fiercest rival in the South, they started ordering pure jets, like the Douglas DC-8.
Because jets are faster, they're smoother, and they obviously represent the future.
Exactly. But Rickenbacker stubbornly dug his heels in. He believed pure jets were just too expensive, too fuel-hungry, and essentially untested for Eastern's short-haul network up and down the coast.
So what did he buy instead?
Instead of jets, he invested heavily in propeller-driven Lockheed Electras and Martin 404s.
Okay, so picture this. While Delta passengers are gliding through the sky at 500 miles an hour in a sleek new jet, Eastern passengers are vibrating in older propeller planes, eating their $1.25 meals and getting rained on during boarding.
Exactly, and the market punished them for it almost immediately. This massive strategic miscalculation allowed competitors to just eat into their market share.
And the board noticed.
Oh, they noticed. By 1959, the board of directors had enough. They ousted Rickenbacker as CEO, though, he did remain chairman until 1963. But the board realized they needed new leadership to drag Eastern into the modern era.
So they replace him.
Yes, replacing him first with Malcolm McIntyre and later with Floyd Hall.
And drag it they did.
Yeah.
It's fascinating how a company can completely invert its personality basically overnight.
Yeah.
Under McIntyre and Hall, Eastern aggressively pivoted away from Rickenbacker's cheap piston engine mindset.
Total 180-degree turn.
Yeah, they aimed for absolute technological prestige. They became the launch customer for the Boeing 727, flying its very first commercial route in February 1964.
Right.
Later, they became the first U.S. carrier to fly the Airbus A300, and they served as the launch customer for the Boeing 757. They wanted the newest, most advanced toys in the sky.
They wanted to be seen as innovators again.
Exactly. But for my money, the crown jewel of this era, the real revolution they brought to the industry, was the Eastern Air Shuttle.
Oh, without a doubt. Inaugurated on April 30th, 1961, the Eastern Air Shuttle fundamentally disrupted domestic travel.
We talked about it at the very beginning of the deep dive.
Right. They set up hourly flights connecting New York's LaGuardia, Washington National, and Boston's Logan airports. They used those 95-seat Lockheed Constellations, running a continuous loop from 7 a.m. to 10 p.m.
The mechanics of how this operated are just mind-blowing to think about today. It was a no reservations, pay cash on board model.
Unheard of today.
You didn't book a ticket weeks in advance. You just showed up at the airport, walked onto the plane, and sat down. Once they took off, a flight attendant literally pushed a cart down the aisle, and you handed them cash or a check for your ticket.
And the guarantee was the truly revolutionary part. If that 95-seat Constellation filled up, Eastern guaranteed you a seat.
Right, the backup plane.
Exactly. They would roll out a second aircraft to accommodate the overflow, even if it meant flying a massive plane for a single passenger. It was unprecedented flexibility and reliability for the business traveler.
But I wonder about the psychology of that shift. Up until this point, flying was an event. People dressed up. It was luxurious. It had this glamour to it.
Yes, very formal.
Did the air shuttle essentially demystify the magic of aviation? Like, did they take the miracle of human flight and reduce it to a high-speed commuter bus service?
They absolutely commoditized it, especially for the business sector. They proved that for certain demographics, the value proposition wasn't luxury or glamour. It was pure, unadulterated convenience.
Time was money.
Time was money, and this strategy worked brilliantly for them. During this period, they also expanded aggressively to compensate for some of their domestic limitations.
Where'd they go?
They pushed deep into the Caribbean, Santo Domingo, Nassau, San Juan. And in 1982, they executed an incredibly shrewd maneuver. Braniff International went bankrupt, and Eastern swooped in and acquired their South American routes for a mere $11 million.
Wait, $11 million for a massive Latin American footprint out of Miami? That is an absolute steal.
It was a brilliant acquisition that gave them dominance in Latin America for years.
So if you take a snapshot of Eastern Airlines in the late 1970s and early 1980s, they look invincible. They've modernized their fleet with cutting-edge jets. They completely dominate the East Coast shuttle corridor. They're expanding internationally into South America.
Right. They're at their peak.
The Fortress Rickenbacker build has been totally upgraded. But this is where the story takes a dark turn for you listening. We are about to look at the external shockwave that unraveled this entire empire. It's the absolute catalyst of their collapse, the 1978 Airline Deregulation Act.
To understand why deregulation was so devastating to Eastern, you have to understand the artificial environment they had been living in. Prior to 1978, the airline industry was controlled by the Civil Aeronautics Board, or the CAB.
And what did the CAB actually do?
The CAB functioned essentially as a public utility commission. The government dictated exactly which routes an airline was allowed to fly, and more importantly, they set the exact fares the airlines could charge.
Wait, meaning the government pulled all the strings on pricing?
Exactly. You couldn't just lower your ticket price to beat a competitor. It was literally illegal. So airlines didn't compete on price. They competed on service, on schedules, on having better meals, or friendlier flight attendants.
It was a highly protected, strictly regulated ecosystem. And then President Jimmy Carter signs the Airline Deregulation Act in 1978, and the CAB is stripped away.
It's gone.
Suddenly, the government isn't setting the prices anymore.
And the industry is violently thrust into a brutal free market battle. Overnight, market share is based almost entirely on who can offer the cheapest ticket.
And this is where Eastern's rich history suddenly becomes a fatal liability. Eastern was a legacy carrier. They had been around for decades.
Which means legacy costs.
Right. That meant they were burdened by a massive, highly paid, heavily unionized workforce. Their pilots, mechanics, and flight attendants had years of seniority, which meant high salaries and robust pensions. Suddenly, they're forced into an arena with aggressive, lean, low-cost startup competitors.
Companies like People Express. These new startups didn't have 50 years of legacy costs. They didn't have massive pension obligations.
They were starting fresh.
Yeah, they hired non-union workers at a fraction of the cost, and they offered bare bones El Cheapo Ferris.
So if People Express is charging $40 for a flight, and Eastern needs to charge $100 just to break even on their labor costs, Eastern has a massive problem.
A completely unsustainable problem.
They had to slash their prices just to keep passengers from defecting, which immediately sparked brutal, margin-eroding fare wars.
And the geographic epicenter of this war was their hub in Atlanta, Georgia. Eastern had built a massive operation at Hartsfield-Jackson Airport, but they were sharing that hub with Delta Airlines.
Their old rival.
Yes, and deregulation exposed a massive structural advantage that Delta held over Eastern.
What was the advantage?
Labor structure. Delta was a largely non-unionized workforce with a deeply ingrained culture of employee management cooperation. Because they weren't locked into rigid union contracts, Delta's labor costs were significantly lower, and their workforce was much more flexible.
So when the fare wars hit, Delta could absorb the financial blows and adapt much faster than Eastern could.
Exactly.
It's like taking older, heavier animals that have been raised in a highly protected, strictly regulated zoo where the zookeeper feeds them every single day and suddenly releasing them into the wild.
That's a great way to picture it.
They're entirely unequipped to outmaneuver the lean, hungry predators that have evolved specifically for that ruthless environment.
That analogy perfectly captures the systemic shock they experienced. The brand decay was almost immediate. As Eastern desperately tried to match budget fares by cutting corners on service, they alienated the premium business travelers who used to rely on them.
They lost their core demographic.
They did. They became the punchline of the industry. The public started calling them the greyhounds of the air.
Which is a tragic fall from the Great Silver Fleet. And navigating this unprecedented shock fell to a new CEO, Frank Borman. Now, for those who know their space history, this is the Frank Borman.
The astronaut.
Yes, the former NASA astronaut who commanded the Apollo 8 mission, the first crew to orbit the moon. He becomes CEO in 1975, just before deregulation hits, and his strategy to survive this new wilderness was a massive, multi-billion-dollar gamble.
Borman believed the key to undercutting the low-cost competitors wasn't just fighting over wages, it was fuel efficiency. The 1970s were defined by massive oil crises and skyrocketing fuel costs.
So he looked at the trend lines?
He looked at the data and concluded that fuel prices were only going to keep rising indefinitely.
So he goes on a shopping spree.
He accumulates massive, crippling debt to completely modernize the fleet, purchasing dozens of the Airbus A300 and the Boeing 757.
Which are very fuel-efficient planes.
Extremely efficient. His logic was sound based on the 1970s economy. If oil prices stayed sky high, Eastern's hyper-efficient new planes would give them a massive cost advantage over rivals who were still flying older, gas-guzzling jets.
Right. The savings on fuel would essentially pay for the planes and then some.
That was the plan.
But global events completely blindsided him. The macroeconomic environment shifted violently. Global oil prices didn't keep going up. They cratered. In 1980, oil was sitting at around $37 a barrel. By 1986, it had plummeted to $15 a barrel.
And just like that, the massive fuel savings advantage that Borman literally bet the entire company on completely evaporated.
Because cheap oil means efficient planes don't matter as much.
Exactly. The older gas-guzzling planes of his competitors were suddenly cheap to fly again, but Eastern was left holding a catastrophic $3.5 billion debt load for the new planes.
To make that statistic visceral for you listening, Eastern Airlines was paying an astonishing $700,000 in daily interest.
Every single.
They were bleeding the equivalent of a luxury home every single morning before a single passenger even bought a cup of coffee. The interest alone was drowning them.
Is suffocating.
But I want to challenge the historical narrative here. Frank Borman catches a lot of flack for this. But could he truly be blamed for his fleet strategy? Was the unpredictable global crash in oil prices simply a stroke of catastrophic bad luck that made a sound, logical strategy look incredibly foolish in hindsight?
Well, if you look at it objectively, Borman's strategy was grounded in the best forecasting data available at the time. Had global fuel prices remained high, his foresight would have been hailed as visionary.
You would have been a genius.
He would have been the genius who saved Eastern. However, a CEO is ultimately judged by the balance sheet, not their intentions. The reality was that Eastern was sinking under $3.5 billion of debt. With the fuel advantage neutralized, Borman was left with only one lever to pull to reduce costs and save the company.
Labor. He had to go after the employees' paychecks.
Exactly. And this introduces the broader political and social climate of the 1980s, which is crucial context here.
Right, and we need to look at this impartially. In 1981, President Ronald Reagan fired thousands of striking air traffic controllers, effectively breaking the PATICO union.
A watershed moment.
Regardless of how anyone feels politically about that decision, historians broadly agree that this action fundamentally altered the national labor dynamic in the United States.
It did, by a sitting president taking such decisive, uncompromising action against a federal union. It emboldened corporate management nationwide.
It sent a signal.
It sent a massive signal. Private companies realized they could take a much harder, more aggressive line against organized labor. And at Eastern Airlines, a company with a long, proud history of strong unionization, this set the stage for bitter, uncompromising standoff.
Because Borman desperately needed wage concessions. He needed the International Association of Machinists, the IAM, and the Airline Pilots Association, LLPA, to take pay cuts to stave off bankruptcy.
He did.
And initially, there was a glimmer of hope.
There was, yeah.
Yeah.
Between 1983 and 1985, there was a brief period of collaboration. The employees actually agreed to wage cuts, and in exchange, they received stock incentives and actual seats on the board of directors.
Which is pretty progressive for the time.
It was a very progressive attempt at shared sacrifice, but the financial hole was simply too deep, and the relationship quickly deteriorated.
The trust just evaporated. And when management and labor are at war, the operational decay becomes publicly visible. Planes aren't maintained as quickly, flights are delayed, service plummets.
The passengers feel it immediately.
In 1987, the FAA hit Eastern with a $9.5 million fine for safety violations. That wasn't just a regulatory slap on the wrist, that was a symptom of a company tearing itself apart from the inside.
The culture was toxic.
The employees were angry, management was desperate, and safety protocols were slipping.
Right. And by 1986, the unions led by a very militant leader named Charles Bryan of the IAM, they smelled blood in the water. They looked at Borman's pleas for more pay cuts and flat out refused further concessions.
They just said no.
They effectively pushed Borman into a corner where he had absolutely no way to pay the debt.
And into that corner stepped Frank Lorenzo. In 1986, Lorenzo's holding company, Texas Air Corporation, acquired Eastern Airlines for $615 million.
A monumental shift.
Now, you need to understand who Frank Lorenzo was in the aviation world at this time. He was the boogeyman to organized labor.
Lorenzo was infamous. In 1983, he had taken Continental Airlines, which he also owned, into Chapter 11 bankruptcy, specifically to exploit a legal loophole that allowed him to void the union contracts.
He just erased them.
He fired the unionized workforce, tore up their contracts, and offered them their jobs back the next day at vastly reduced pay.
So when the Eastern unions hear that Frank Lorenzo is their new boss, they view his arrival with absolute terror. They know exactly what his playbook is.
And Lorenzo's management of Eastern remains one of the most heavily scrutinized, controversial periods in corporate history. The unions immediately accused him of predatory management and systemic asset stripping.
Taking the good parts for himself.
Exactly. They argued he was deliberately cannibalizing Eastern Airlines to benefit his non-union carrier, Continental Airlines, and the Texas Air Holding Company.
And when you look at the specific data points of this asset stripping, it is chilling. It's almost unbelievable what he got away with. For example, Lorenzo took Eastern's highly advanced computerized reservation system, known as SOTA, and sold it to his own holding company, Texas Air. But he sold it for merely 40% of its actual market value.
It gets worse. After buying the system for pennies on the dollar, Texas Air then turned around and forced Eastern to pay $10 million a month in fees just to use its own reservation system.
Wait, Lorenzo sells Eastern's own proprietary asset to his other company at a massive discount and then charges Eastern exorbitant rent to use the system they built. How is that even legal? Isn't that just blatant corporate theft?
Well, it was legally classified as an intra-company transfer within the holding company structure, but ethically, it was highly dubious.
I'll say.
And he didn't stop there. He transferred 6 of Eastern's aircraft over to Continental for absolutely nothing. No money changed hands.
Unbelievable.
And then, in 1989, he sold the absolute crown jewel of the empire, the Eastern Air Shuttle, the operation that practically defined the brand, to Donald Trump for $365 million.
So he is selling off the furniture while the house is burning down. Eventually, Lorenzo agreed to pay a $280 million out-of-court settlement in 1990 regarding Texas Air's asset stripping of Eastern, but by then, the damage was irreversible.
The company was a shell.
But I have to ask you to evaluate Lorenzo objectively here, separating the emotion from the math. Was this purely malicious corporate raiding designed to destroy Eastern out of an anti-union animus? Or was he ruthlessly executing the only legal maneuvers available to perform triage salvaging the broader Texas air portfolio by sacrificing Eastern because Eastern's debt made it mathematically doomed anyway?
That is the core debate among aviation historians. From a purely financial perspective, Lorenzo's defenders argue he was performing necessary corporate triage.
A sort of necessary evil.
Right. Eastern's labor costs were inflexible, their $3.5 billion debt structure was unsustainable, and he was simply extracting whatever value remained to fortify the viable assets within Texas Air before the ship sank.
And the other side.
However, from the perspective of corporate governance and labor relations, his methods were viewed as aggressively hostile, predatory, and completely ethically hollow.
It's an irreconcilable conflict. You have management's cold financial engineering on one side and labor's desperate demand for job security on the other. And this tension finally exploded in the fatal climax of our story, the strike of March 4th, 1989.
On that day, the International Association of Machinists walked out. But what made this strike different and ultimately fatal was the solidarity.
Who else joined them?
The machinists were supported by ALPA, the pilots' union, and TWU, the flight attendants' union. The pilots and flight attendants refused to cross the machinists' picket lines.
The airline was effectively grounded overnight. Thousands of flights were canceled. The financial hemorrhaging was catastrophic, costing the already indebted airline an estimated $4 million daily in lost revenue.
They couldn't survive that.
No. Just 5 days later, realizing the cash flow was dead, on March 9, 1989, Eastern Airlines filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy.
Lorenzo claimed the bankruptcy was a necessary step to reorganize the debt and save the company. But the unions viewed it exactly as they had feared since day one, as Lorenzo's standard tactic to get a judge to void their union contracts, just like he did at Continental.
But the courts surprised everyone, didn't they?
They did. The bankruptcy court was overseen by Judge Burton Liffland, and he took a highly unprecedented step. In 1990, after reviewing the staggering financial decay and the clear evidence of improper asset transfers to Texas Air, Judge Liffland forcibly removed Frank Lorenzo from control of Eastern Airlines.
That is a massive deal.
It is incredibly rare for a bankruptcy judge to fire the owner of a company, but the court deemed Lorenzo incapable of fairly managing the reorganization.
So Lorenzo is out, and the court appoints a trustee, a man named Martin Shugru, to attempt a miracle and save the airline. Shugru comes in and launches a desperate Hail Mary strategy to get cash flowing again. He introduces what he called the Why Not fares.
The Why Not fares were essentially a fire sale. Shugru ordered the airline to rip out standard coach seats and double the size of the first-class cabins on their planes.
Okay.
Then he sold those luxury first-class tickets at standard coach prices, desperately trying to lure back the lucrative business travelers who had abandoned Eastern for Delta or American.
It's a clever idea. Give people champagne for the price of beer to rebuild the brand loyalty. But once again, for the second time in this company's history, global events delivered a fatal, completely unpredictable blow. In August 1990, Iraq invaded Kuwait.
The Gulf War crisis immediately triggered a massive global panic over oil supplies. The price of West Texas crude shot up overnight, climbing from $18.30 a barrel all the way up to $40.85 a barrel.
So fuel cost more than double instantly. Shugru's Why Not strategy relied entirely on having low operational costs while he rebuilt a customer base.
Yeah.
Suddenly, his biggest expense doubles, and he has no revenue to cover it. The math is broken.
The financial data from Eastern's final full year, 1990, paints a portrait of total, inescapable systemic failure. Under the trustees' management, the airline posted a negative 92.8% return.
Oh, wow.
In just 8 months, they suffered operating losses totaling $442 million.
And people just weren't flying them. Their system-wide seat load factor, which is the percentage of seats actually filled with paying customers, sat at a dismal 57.8%.
Barely half full.
Nearly half the plane was empty on average. Rickenbacker's cardinal rule of putting bums on seats was completely shattered. It was financially impossible to continue.
The cascading failures hit every level of the company. They missed a crucial $80.5 million pension payment.
Which affects real people's lives.
Exactly. That forced the federal government, specifically the Pension Benefit Guaranty Corporation, or the PBGC, to step in and take over 51,000 employee pensions to prevent the workers from losing their life savings.
Even their competitors were getting angry. Other airlines started complaining to the bankruptcy court that the judge was artificially propping up a zombie company. By allowing Eastern to sell tickets below cost just to generate cash, it was dragging down fares across the entire industry and hurting healthy companies.
The whole ecosystem was suffering.
Finally, the cash reserves completely vanished. There was nothing left to borrow. At midnight on Saturday, January 19, 1991, Eastern Airlines ceased operations forever. The planes landed, the gates were locked, and an empire vanished.
Before we close, I think it's important to analyze the mechanics of that final strike.
I agree, because I want to look at that 1989 strike one last time. From the outside, it really looks like a fatal miscalculation by the labor unions. It feels like a massive game of corporate chicken, where both Frank Lorenzo and the union leaders stubbornly guaranteed their mutual destruction.
It does look that way on paper.
The workers went on strike against a company that was already drowning in $3.5 billion of debt. Didn't they realize that by stopping the cash flow, they weren't going to win better wages? They were just accelerating their own unemployment.
It is the ultimate tragic reality of the labor management dynamic in the 1980s. You have to understand the psychology of the workers. The unions genuinely felt that conceding to Frank Lorenzo wasn't just about Eastern Airlines.
It was bigger than that.
Yes. They believed that if Lorenzo successfully busted their union, it would mean the death of organized labor across the entire aviation industry. So they drew a line in the sand, willing to burn the company down rather than surrender.
And management felt that without total capitulation from labor, the brutal math of deregulation would kill them anyway.
Precisely. It was guaranteed mutual destruction. To synthesize this incredible tragedy, Eastern Airlines evolved from a pioneering, highly profitable innovator that defined the golden age of aviation under Eddie Rickenbacker into a debt-laden casualty of a deregulated free market.
They were trapped.
They were caught in an inescapable vice. On one side, the crushing debt of Frank Borman's ill-timed fleet modernization. On another side, the aggressive, predatory asset stripping of Frank Lorenzo's Texas Air. And finally, an intractable labor war that rendered any ability to adapt to a changing world completely impossible.
It is a stunning, agonizing collapse of a corporate titan. We've covered a massive amount of history today, from the secret spoils conference of the 1930s to the midnight shutdown in 1991. But I want to leave you, the listener, with a final, chilling consideration to ponder on your own.
It's an important question to ask.
The explicitly stated intention of the 1978 Airline Deregulation Act, the law that sparked this entire collapse, was to destroy monopolies. The government wanted to foster competition and lower fares for you, the consumer. But look at the aftermath today. Think about your last flight on a budget airline. The cramped seats, the nickel and diming for every bag, the lack of service.
It's a very different experience.
Did the brutal collapse of legacy carriers like Eastern Airlines actually create a competitive utopia? Or did it merely clear the battlefield for today's modern mega-mergers? We're left with a modern aviation landscape that is arguably just as monopolized as the era of the Big Four, but with a fraction of the historical glamour, almost zero accountability, and fewer geographic options.
It makes you wonder.
Did deregulation actually give us the freedom of the skies? Or did it just change the names of the monopolists painted on the side of the aircraft? Think about that the next time you're squeezed into a middle seat.